Hey everybody, Jake here from Bearded Gear, and I'm ready to do my full review on this guy. This is the Giant Mouse Ace Nimbus version 2, the new version of the Nimbus that they just recently came out with, and this knife was loaned to me by my buddy LeftyEDC. He will be linked down below in the description. He's become a good friend at this point. We talk all the time. We buy and sell and trade knives pretty frequently at this point. And he's just a really cool dude who's super into knives and is left-handed. So if you're also left-handed, he's an especially good person to follow. I sympathize with him a lot because I'm left-handed for certain things. Like I write and I shoot left-handed, but typically with knives I'm right-handed, although I do pass knives to my left hand somewhat frequently. And like in the kitchen, I find when I'm like doing food prep, I often use my left hand. Anyways, so I sympathize with him, even though I carry my knives front right pocket and typically use pocket knives right-handed. I feel for the lefties out there because, like, for firearms components, it really sucks. Like finding holster setups and good things in that arena. So I can imagine finding good lefty pocket knives is not fun either. Anyways, this knife I have now had in my possession for about 2 weeks, and I haven't carried it as much as I typically would for a full review, if I'm being totally honest. But I want to get it back to Kevin, and I also just I don't feel like I'm finding anything more out of this. I've carried it a handful of times. I've done some light cutting with it. It's a loaner, so I haven't been rough on it at all. Mostly just opening packages, and I just am not in love with it. So if you're familiar with my history with Giant Mouse knives, I'm not going to go super into detail, but I had a couple early on that just weren't very good, either in build quality or design or like quality control issues, things like that. And so I was a little bit turned off to them, but then I got the Grand, and the Grand changed everything for me. I adore the Grand. It is one of my favorite knives that I own, and I like just about everything about it. I really love that knife. After I got the Grand, Giant Mouse sent me a Biblio to check out because I had mentioned that my first experience with the Biblio was less than ideal, and the second Biblio that I got was really good. I have that knife still. I carry it from time to time. I like the Biblio. I've got reviews on each of those if you want to see my deeper thoughts on them. So when Giant Mouse announced they were coming out with this guy, I got really excited because I like their knives now. And I've been impressed with the last several that I've had. And it's not at all that this knife isn't nice or up to the same like build quality or caliber that the Grand or that Biblio I have are. It's more just, I really don't think this design quite works for me. So if you've watched my first impressions, it probably won't be too much of a surprise, but I want to go over a couple of things that have just made me not love this knife. It's not that I don't like it or appreciate it for what it is, I just don't love it. And it falls in the shadow of the Grand, frankly. The Grand is one of my favorite knives, and this knife just doesn't really hold a candle to it, in my opinion, for me. So first things first, let's talk what this knife is made of, and then we'll just kind of go through what I've found with it. So it's got green micarta, which I quite like the look of. I really dig that material. The blade steel on here is going to be L-Max. We have liners in here, I believe are just stainless steel, almost positive. Got a couple of barrel spacers. We've got a wire, deep carry, pocket clip. I say deep carry, but I always like to point out when there's a deep carry clip that doesn't come to the end of the knife, it's not actually deep carry, is it? So there's that. And then internally the liners are hollowed out a little bit. There's some kind of sizable holes drilled into them, and that's what we're working with materials wise. Now let's talk about the things that I do really like about this knife. The things I really like about this knife are probably the things that I really like about most Giant Mouse knives. I really like the micarta. I like the way it's finished. I like the way it feels. I like the way it's contoured. They've done a good job on these handle scales, and I like the material that they used to begin with. So the handle scales are very good. I like the micarta. Another thing that I really like, the crown spine. I love when knife companies do a good crown spine. I wish that was more common. I'm not sure why it's not. It's just this excellent touch that immediately makes a knife feel higher end to me than just having a cornered off spine. The other thing on the spine that's fantastic is the jimping placement. Another thing that I'm not sure why more people don't do. I can't imagine it's like Giant Mouse has a patent on putting jimping up here. I don't think that's a thing. If I ever design a knife, when that day comes, I will probably place jimping up here if there's any jimping. That is where jimping should go, in my opinion. That's where my thumb wants to go in a saber grip. I like that they do that. Another thing that I like, the blade grind itself. It's a nice full flat grind. As an EDC knife, this blade shape and grind is quite good. It gets relatively thin behind the edge, not crazy thin. I'd call it similar to like my Para 3. And then it's got a nice precise tip on it, which I find I really like for EDC knives specifically. Beyond that, there are a lot of things that are fine to me, but those are probably the traits that most stick out. Now, the thing that makes me not love this knife, if I had to pinpoint it to one thing in particular, it's just frankly going to be the action, but more so it's my access to the hole. Because the way that this blade rides feels like my Grand. It doesn't feel very different at all. The Grand is a slight bit smoother, probably because it's more worn in, but the Grand is one of my favorite knives to Spidey flick. That's the way that I open it, just about every single time. It's got the hole for deployment. That's my favorite method of deployment. I like to middle finger flick it. It just works supremely well. I can also thumb flick it. That works great. The action on the Grand is one of my favorite things about it. And that's what I expect out of having this shape hole and these materials and this type of build. In my head, this knife should be really similar to that. I get the blade weight is different, and a couple things are different here, but it should feel similar to that. And it just doesn't really to me. And I think the culprit here is the access to the hole, which is interesting because I'm fairly certain that the version 2 of this knife, which this is, one of the updates they made was they improved the access to the hole. If this is the better access to the hole, then I have no interest in version 1 of this knife, because I thought I really wanted this knife for myself. In fact, Kevin said I could purchase this one from him if I wanted to, and I don't want to. I don't feel a desire to own this knife. I've gotten better at reliably Spidey flicking it, but every now and then it's still not ideal, and it's just, yeah, see, the access to the hole is not perfect. They've blocked part of it on this side, and it's just difficult to get my middle finger up into there, and it's not comfortable to deploy. On a thumb flick, it's better, but even that took a little bit of like a learning curve to figure out right where to put my thumb and to get it right, and it feels a little bit uncomfortable the way my finger kind of pushes into this part of the scale up here as I'm deploying the knife with my thumb. It just doesn't feel ideal to me to deploy. Now, to a lot of people, deployment is very low on their list of what they want in a knife. And so for them, they might like this a lot more. But I just, it's extra important to me. And if there was another factor on this knife that was like a real redeeming quality that made this knife feel ultra special to me, then I'd probably like it more. But when I compare it to the Grand for me has better ergos. The Grand for me carries even slightly better, frankly, which is funny because it's a little bit bigger and a little bit heavier. But the clip placement is better. I love the way that the Grand sits in pocket. And the Nimbus is actually a little bit thicker, which one of the biggest identifiers for a knife that's comfortable to carry for me is thinness in this direction. So the fact that this is a little bit thicker, it feels a little bit bulkier in pocket. So yeah, any way that I compare this to the Grand, it falls short for me. But other people this design may totally resonate with, and it may be fantastic for them. So I don't want to say that this knife is bad. I want to reiterate, it's not doing anything wrong here. I think this design from Giant Mouse just isn't a design for me. And that's totally fair. That's different from there being a bad knife. There are a lot of knives out there that are really good quality and people love that just aren't for me. It's kind of like, this knife isn't at all similar to it, but like the Chris Reeve Sebenza. I'm very open about the fact that that is a good knife. It is quality. There is a lot about it that I don't personally like or prefer, but it would be wrong for me to say that that's a bad knife. That would be a lie. It's not a bad knife. It's just not what I want out of a knife. And I think this is kind of like that, especially because I own the Grand and I own the Biblio, and I just like both of those knives better than this one. And so the fact that this is doing a lot of the same things but isn't scratching the itch as much as those do just makes me not really love it. But yeah, I'll go real quick through my typical kind of list of things that I talk about with knives, ergos and action and all that, just to kind of encapsulate it for those who are looking to know whether they would like this knife. I don't want to make it all about me. That would be not fair. It's my channel. Why should I only talk about me? Anyways, here we go. So ergos on this knife, I would say, are good. Not fantastic for my hands, but the rounding on the scales and the scale material feels quite good. It fills the hand very well, especially for the size of the knife. I'm able to get all 4 fingers on here, even in a saber grip or a hammer grip. Reverse grip is actually, to me, a little bit better, I think, than having it forward. It's fine in a draw cut, feels pretty good in that way. Reverse grip draw cut will work. So ergos are passable. Again, the Grand for me is a little bit better. The Biblio is less comparable because it's a lot smaller and has the forward choil and all that, but gun to my head, I prefer the Biblio ergos as well. So for my hands, it's good ergos, not great. The size of this groove up here is a little bit funky to me. I get like 1.5 fingers in there, and so I think that's why it's not better, frankly. My middle finger kind of lands right on this like point, this hump here, and that's not ideal. Action, I've already talked about quite a bit. It's, if you don't care about like swift deployment and like snappy action or like drop shuttiness, then you'll probably like this knife. But it's not drop shutty at all. It's smooth. If you slow roll your knives out, you'll probably like this, because that's, I think, the best way to open it, frankly. But it's just, for me, it's not great. But it's not that it doesn't lock up when you get it right. The problem is it can be a little bit difficult to get it just right. And I've had to really like master middle finger flicking this knife and thumb flicking it. Neither one came super naturally to me. And still every now and then I like slip up and it doesn't deploy all the way. So it's just less than ideal for me. Cutting performance, I think, is probably for me where this knife is going to shine the most. This blade is done quite well. It feels similar to me to my Para 3. I think both in blade length and in grind and the way that this knife works for me. That's probably my most comparable knife to kind of put it up against. And so it's a good cutter, but I have knives that are slicier. I have knives that I definitely prefer the performance of. And like specifically with the Para 3, I think the blades do about as well as each other, but the ergos on the Para 3 for me are so much better that I have a better time cutting with that knife, if that makes sense. So it's a good blade. The grind is done well. The edge that came on it is fantastic. It's got a good precise tip on it without being too thin. It's a nice blade stock. The fact that they've done those extra steps of placing the jimping up here and crowning the spine definitely gets it extra points in my mind. But yeah, we'll call that the cutting performance. And then carry I already talked about compared to the Grand. It's thicker, it's a little bit rounder, and so this knife does not feel light or tiny in pocket. It's not a heavy knife, it's not a huge knife, but it doesn't hide itself well in pocket. And the fact that the deep carry clip doesn't actually carry deep, personally for me, just irks me a little bit. So I think that's about it. I think that's a good encapsulation of my feelings of the Ace Nimbus version 2. It's a cool knife. I can see why I've seen other people rave about it, and I would be off base to say that they're wrong. I get why this knife resonates with certain people. It's just not for me, and that's totally fine. In fact, it's probably better if knife companies have a diverse enough lineup that even if I love some of their knives, I don't really like their others, because that means they're able to reach a broader base of people, and that's a good thing. I want more and more people to be into knives, and variety is a good thing. So the Nimbus just isn't for me, and that's going to be my kind of conclusion on it. But it's nice. It's well made. It's a good giant mouse. If anybody was asking me which giant mouse I recommend, it's going to be the Grand every single time at this point. I am floored with how good the Grand is, and with how inexpensive it is for how good it is, and for what excellent materials it comes with. Everyone that I've loaned mine to, with exception actually of Kevin, has offered to purchase it from me, and I have politely declined because this is mine. I think they're starting to become a little more available. They just released another batch of the Grand, which is a good thing. I'm sure this batch won't be around forever, but I think they're just kind of trying to churn them out at this point because it's been so successful for them. So if I were doing a comparison between this and the Grand would run away with it in, I think, every category. So it wouldn't even be fair. And this is going in the mail today to Kevin, so it's not going to happen. But yeah, if you ask me which one is better, I think you know the answer. Anyways, thanks guys, and thanks Kevin for loaning this to me again. He'll be linked down below. I appreciate y'all for watching, and I'll see you on the next one.